How do you write a good costume brief? The costume brief, aka the part of your LARP's rules that tells you what to wear and why, is frequently an afterthought, except when it's actually weirdly integral and way too much effort has been put into it. It's the part of the LARP that is most frequently outsourced to someone else, often without a lot of clear direction. It's either a hideously overproduced core part of your authorial vision, or a last-minute bolt-on that you don't care about, and rarely anything in the middle. But what does a good costume brief look like? What are some of the common pitfalls people run into? Why exactly does this matter? And what even is the point? Part 1. What is the point? Why do you need a costume brief? Your costume is the first thing people will register when they go to interact with your character. It's your first impression. You want that to say something about your character. And, with some guidance, it can say a lot of things within the context of the game world. Where your character is from, what gender they are, whether they're part of a group, what their job is, whether they care about their appearance, and many more. In terms of the LARP as a whole, seeing everyone dressed in an appropriate way creates an atmosphere and makes the game world feel more real. This is just deeply enjoyable for everyone, and for players whose make-believe muscles are not as well exercised yet, it can really help sell that sense of immersion in another world. And finally, being in costume helps you, the player, feel like you're not yourself and are instead inhabiting the life of someone else. Everything from the significance of a particular piece of jewellery acting as an aide-memoire to the way a certain jacket holds your shoulders back, your costume can help you get into character and stay in character. But what makes those things work? What makes a costume immersive for the person wearing it or the person seeing it? It's different for every person. Every time I see a questionable rule around costumes sold as "this will be more immersive," I conclude that you think immersion is some kind of magic gumball machine. You cannot stick tokens in and get immersion. And it's really difficult to generalise, even slightly, across more than about 5 closely related people as to what works and what doesn't. This is a whole other video topic, but immersion is really just a fun way of saying suspension of disbelief. And this is a skill you can actively work to develop instead of sitting there and waiting for it to happen to you. What you can do is build meaning and reason into your costume brief. That's why I ask the question, what is your costume brief for? What do you want out of it? I recommend you sit down and write 3 or 4 guiding principles to either help you write your brief or to hand to the person writing your brief, because I know I'm never going to stop you guys outsourcing the costume brief to your one female member of core crew. And anytime you're not sure about something in the brief, ask yourself, which of these principles does this support? What are good guiding principles? Well, they can be anything, but here are some suggestions. I want this to be easy to costume or financially accessible. I want to encourage people to make really cool things or be creative. I want people to feel cool or powerful or comfortable or stylish. I want people to learn about history. I want your faction, gender or group to be immediately obvious. I want cultures or regions to have distinct styles. Part 2. Your costume brief is bad and you should feel bad. The first thing everyone asks is what makes a bad costume brief, and although everyone can come up with 1 or 2 specific examples, I'm going to try and make some generalizations. Your costume brief is bad if you have one when you don't need one. I've just asked you to come up with some guiding principles, and if you're really struggling, if you're thinking, I don't want any of that, I don't want anything fancy or specific, I just want people to wear a costume, you don't need a costume brief. As long as you can completely let go of the need for people to look a specific way, you don't need a costume brief. The point of LARP is not the costume. The point is the roleplay. Maybe it's a modern day game and the brief is wear clothes. Just make it clear it's modern day and let people wear clothes. If someone shows up in a medieval dress because their character is a LARPer or a goth, is that actually a problem? This tactic also works completely fine for the latter part of the 20th century. If you're setting your game in the 60s onwards, people can probably fudge something that looks about right, even if they're wearing modern clothes. And if they don't, it's not too out of place. And also, do you care? Do you actually care if someone's wearing a Pokemon t-shirt at your 80s game? Some people don't. In which case, you don't have to tell people not to. If it's cyberpunk or sci-fi or steampunk or generic fantasy, maybe you don't need a costume brief, maybe you need a look and feel brief. Instead of a set of guidelines, this is just a set of inspirations, and you're just gonna have to trust that people are going to wear something about right and not stress if they don't. Does it actually ruin your game if someone wears a Regency dress or a crinoline to your elf ball? Probably not. Half the people here are wearing fancy dresses. This is just cut a little different. It's not a big deal. The only real downside to a look and feel brief is that it's very easy to accidentally set the bar very high. If you care about accessibility, financial or physical, you want more guidance than that. I release you, game runners, from the obligation to have a costume brief, and you, players, I release from the expectation that the game runners or other players will judge whether your kit is on brief or not. Frankly, that's gone wildly unchecked for way too long, and you'll need to learn to shut up about other people's clothes and get better at make-believe. A commitment to not judging other people's costumes from players and crew, either at the game or on social media, should be written into codes of conduct. If you've decided that you do need a costume brief, it's probably bad for one of two reasons. The person who wrote it doesn't know anything about costume, or the person who wrote it is a costumer. It's hard to write a costume brief if you don't know a lot about costume. You're not going to be able to frame things in a way that is open-ended enough for people to do something with it. You're not going to be aware of the difficulties or practicalities of specific styles. You're not going to know what stuff is called. You probably have one specific picture in mind, and you don't have the skills to break that down into components and principles that other people can extrapolate from. I find you can tell when someone who doesn't know a whole lot about clothing or costume has written a brief, because it usually ends up being extremely prescriptive. Wear this one specific thing. Look like this photo of a Hollywood production feature film. This website or academic paper tells you exactly what people in the 1500s would have worn, so do that. On the flip side, people often hand off the costume brief to people who do a lot of costuming, which solves the knowledge issue but creates a whole different set of problems. I can often tell when a brief has been written by a costumer because it starts out from the assumption that you're an experienced sewist and doesn't back down. What is easy to sew and what is easy to source if you do not sew at all are very different, and briefs written by costumers often have, as the alternative to here is where you get period correct patterns to make everything from scratch, the absolutely definitely much more achievable options of here is how you can get very specific second-hand clothes and alter them beyond recognition in a way that is surprisingly technically challenging. Thrift flips are harder than sewing from scratch. Only hardcore sewists think that they're easy, and they still rarely do them. Why have we all lied to ourselves for this long? That massively altering clothing is easier than making it from scratch. It's not. Stop telling people who are just learning how to sew to practice by doing major alterations. I cannot overstate that the average sewing ability of a LARPer is none. The handful of people who are really very good are hugely outnumbered by the people who've never done it before, or who could maybe sew a button on at a push. And when you've designed your brief on the assumption that every single person is sewing their costume from scratch, that becomes incredibly expensive and difficult for every single person who doesn't sew. Also, there's the snobbery. You know, all the historical costume snobbery about wearing synthetics instead of silk and cotton instead of linen, or insisting people have to have all the absolutely correct underwear made from all the absolutely correct materials. Yeah, some costume briefs explicitly do that. I don't know why. I don't know why this needs saying, but don't do that. I do not believe for 1 second when you say that you can tell. And I absolutely judge you for thinking it matters. You're not reenactors. It's grown-up fancy dress make-believe. A personal bugbear of mine is when people, usually costumers, have written a costume brief based on their special interest. Speaking as one neurodivergent costumer to another, don't do this. You put way too much information and detail and specificity into it, and it's really obvious you're going to have zero chill if people get it wrong, which they will. No one cares about this as much as you. Finally, there's one more main reason your costume brief might be bad. You're ignoring that fat people exist. Part 3, the person inside the costume. You do not get to dictate, through your costume brief, what the person wearing the costume looks like or what their relationship with their body is. Things that should absolutely not be covered in a costume brief ever include glasses, piercings and tattoos, hair or skin colour, facial hair, mobility aids and other disability support devices, or underwear. I reserve the right to add to that list. You don't get to tell people they have to cover up their binder or that they have to wear a corset. You don't get to create LARP cultures that have prejudices against tattoos. You don't get to tell people that their spectacles are off-brief, or that they should modify their mobility aid to look more in character. If people want to change some of those things, have an in-character walking stick, or wear a wig, or whatever, more power to them, but you cannot demand it. That is prejudiced as hell. Furthermore, before you write anything into a costume brief about how something is supposed to fit, stop and think, is every single LARPer I know going to be comfortable wearing that? Because the answer's no. I have seen costume briefs demand tight trousers, low-cut tops, extremely structured garments around the waist and torso, very baggy and shapeless clothing, short skirts, floor-length skirts, bare arms or sometimes bare torsos, plus a staggering array of things that I feel reasonably confident to say you were thinking of someone me-shaped when you imagined a player wearing this, not someone plus-sized. And trust me, hardly anyone is me-shaped. How do we fix this? You're going to have to put your grown-up trousers on and talk to some fat people. You need plus-size LARPers of all genders to weigh in on your costume brief, whether it's actually accessible to them, and you need to make sure they are comfortable telling you if they would struggle to kit your game and why. In theory, I would say you need input of people of all sizes, but in reality, I find people are usually fine at asking for straight-sized input on their costume brief, which I will charitably assume is a misplaced assumption about what is average, or asking for a general feedback in an open environment where people may be genuinely worried about receiving fatphobic backlash or well-meaning condescension if they criticize you. Also, let's just make revealing tight or excessively baggy clothing just one of the options available, never the only option. People's own body image should never be ruling out which LARP faction they can play. Part 4. Money, money, money. Let's talk about armour. But Ash, I hear you cry, that's combat rules, not costume brief. Armour is always part of your costume brief, even if you put it somewhere else. It is a purely aesthetic choice. If it wasn't, you wouldn't get extra hits and bennies for wearing it, because wearing it alone would do its job. We're not actually trying to kill each other. You should be pulling your blows. The actual difference between full metal plate armour and a kilt and woad is aesthetics, weight, and price tag. You're just wearing it because it makes you look cool and because you can afford it. Its ability to actually protect your body at LARP is totally superfluous, and your body's ability to carry its weight is not something a costume brief should be non-consensually opting you into. On that subject, the single most expensive sentence you can write into a costume brief is, "Armour must cover the chest." Here is a non-ordered list of reasons why I detest this sentence in a brief. Armour is expensive. The most expensive single bit of armour, not counting insane things like articulated gauntlets, the most expensive single readily available bit of armour is chest armour. Chest armour has limited adjustability for size. You can lend your buddy your braces and pauldrons, and while they still won't fit everyone, there's a bigger range of people they can fit. I usually don't have trouble fitting into pauldrons or greaves, despite the fact that I am about half the size the manufacturers expected. If these braces are too short or too long, they have to be very too long for that to be a problem. That's very rarely true of chest armour. Chests are a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and if it's more than about 4 inches too big or too small, in any direction, you're going to really struggle. Chests are also not all the same shape. Not to pick on Wormwick, but there's limited available off-the-rack LARP armour I can point at. Wormwick chest armour will fit you if you are 6 foot and reasonably built with a flat chest. If you are shorter, but the same circumference and or willing to squish your breasts flat, or if you have a 38-inch chest and a very specific bust height. How many people do you know that covers? Chests also aren't super visible, and armour covers up a lot. What if I wear a surcoat or a tabard? Then you can't see my armour. What if I wanted to wear a nice doublet or had a necklace that's important? Well, now you can't see it because of the armour. People default to chest armour in the rules because they think that makes it obvious you're wearing armour to the monster crew. And it just doesn't seem to work that well. Until everyone gets with the program and starts letting people wear cosplay armour, it's all make-believe. We aren't actually hitting each other hard. Let people make armour out of EVA foam and give them the hits anyway. No, it won't look as good, and yes, you'll probably trash it in 2 years, but at least it'll be the right size and not weigh £1 million and not cost hundreds. Until that happens, I think we should just take armour must cover the chest off the drawing board entirely. Some of you are never going to let go of minimum armour requirements, even though, let me reiterate, wearing armour at LARP is a purely aesthetic choice and has little actual mechanical bearing on the combat rules, which you wrote. If your armor is so heavy it affects your combat ability, then yeah, you sure committed to that aesthetic choice. I really just can't get over the fact that the weapons are fake, the hits are pulled, the hit points are an abstract, the magic isn't real, but the armor has to be 100% real or it doesn't count. That's completely logical. So as an alternative, I suggest shoulders. Everyone likes pauldrons. You can buy them one at a time if you need to save money. You can make them out of a lot of materials, including EVA foam, chain or padded fabric to cover your shoulders even, and take it from a costumer, the shoulders of your costume are rarely very exciting. They're easy to take on and off and stash somewhere when you're not wearing them. They're pretty easy to lend to a buddy. The rigid, very curved ones are not very size inclusive, but there's a bunch of more open, flexible options. They're available off the rack or custom, and they look badass. More broadly, how expensive is this brief and how are people going to afford the costume for this LARP are questions that not enough people ask themselves before shoving their finished kit brief out into the wild. If you're demanding anything remotely historically accurate or elaborate fantasy kit that isn't easy to fudge with modern pieces, your players who don't sew are going to be dropping upwards of £200 a head. Like, have you looked at Arm Street or Bergschneider prices recently? Not everyone has existing kit they can reuse, especially if they're new or if your LARP's kit brief is very specific. And, I really can't keep saying this enough, most LARPers don't sew, and I cannot single-handedly change that fact in spite of how hard I try. This isn't just fantasy. Lots of cyberpunk games focus really heavily on the cool factor of light-up clothing elements. That stuff's expensive and breaks easily, so it has to be replaced for the next game. It's not a one-off investment. Lots, and I mean lots, of games decide that the way you discern rich people in-game is that they should wear more expensive clothing. A surprising number of kit briefs demand game-specific symbols on things, or just highly specific items. Once again, many LARPers don't sew. While I love that you're keeping the commission industry alive, that is an expensive commitment. And finally, maybe not lots, but more than a few LARPs call for nation or faction-specific armor, and congrats, you've just created a tiered list of how financially accessible the different factions in your game are. Like, that's super weird. How have you not stopped and thought about how much easier and cheaper it is to buy leather armor than scale mail before writing that this one faction never wears leather and only wears scale mail? Part 5, Visual Cues. One of the big categories that we covered under the core themes was I want this thing about your character to be immediately obvious. It's a popular one, so how do you do that? As previously mentioned, there are bad ways of doing this. If the costume for one nation or one archetype is significantly more expensive than the alternative, that's bad. If your gender markers are things like cleavage or beard, that's bad. If one faction's distinctive costumes is leggings or a low-cut top, no alternatives, that's bad. So what's good? May I introduce you to arbitrary standards? Want to show off how rich your character is? Let's just say white is an expensive colour. If you're wearing a lot of white, you're rich. If you're not rich, wear a different colour. Big costume jewellery doesn't have to be a specific style or quantity, just wear something. Maybe it's an early medieval inspired fantasy and beads are really expensive. Or maybe leaves are a symbol associated with prosperity. If you wear some kind of leaf motif, you're rich. Want to make sure your character is gendered correctly. Red is feminine, blue is masculine. Purple is exciting. Keys are feminine and shells are masculine. Skirts are feminine and trousers are masculine. Minimal or no rules on style and length is an easy one for historical settings, which lets people play regardless of their in real life gender or presentation. I relatively recently had to come up with a stricter gender rule for medieval style costumes, where everyone is potentially wearing long robes or gowns, and went with some kind of headgear is woman, none is man, which isn't remotely historically accurate, but that isn't the point. It's easy and obvious and relatively cheap to implement and kind of works with people's preconceived ideas around medieval fantasy, where women are often wearing veils or hats or circlets and men rarely are. Want something faction specific. This faction wears symbols relating to the sea, and this one, animals and birds. This faction wears red, and this faction wears black. This faction loves knitwear, and this faction likes anything that looks like leather. Just pick something and say it means something else. As long as you keep it minimal and sleek and ideally at least vaguely intuitive, you can get away with almost anything. Arbitrary symbols are, I think, my personal favourites. To be clear, I do not mean symbols specific to your LARP. Those are nice to have, but should never be a core part of your costume brief. That is a treat for overachievers. If you're picking a distinctive faction symbol, make it something really easy to find in a lot of different styles and formats. Leaves, fruit, insects, shells, animals and birds, feathers, snowflakes, flowers, or even just big-ass gems are all relatively easy to find on jewellery at a variety of price points and sometimes fabric prints, so that basically anyone can make sure they have at least a leaf brooch or a leaf patterned scarf or something, usually for under a $5. Arbitrary items of clothing are fine as long as they are broad. You can emphasize a longer, flowier silhouette, for example, but people will have different tolerance levels for what that looks like and different budgets for how to implement it. Saying wear one or several scarves and shawls, though, is super interesting and gives you a lot of room to play. The rule about women having to wear skirts or some kind of heads covering, we didn't specify what length the skirt had to be or what kind of head covering, and we had everything from floor-length period dresses to pencil skirts and full veils to flower crowns and headbands, and it all worked. You can also assign arbitrary colours, although that has additional considerations. Part 6, the whole rainbow. Picture this, a not uncommon scenario in a LARP. It's a fantasy setting and you've actually been really chill about the costume brief. You've got 3 factions, it's important that people can tell, and you've decided to colour code them. So obviously they're red, blue and yellow. Now walk into a charity shop or clothing store and try and find something yellow that even vaguely works for a fantasy LARP game. Can you even find anything yellow? Anything at all? Most of your players don't sew, which means most of your players are picking out of existing costume pieces they own or picking up off the rack or secondhand clothes. And some colours are just not that popular. A lot of LARPs have a red or green faction. Very few LARPs have an orange faction. The chances of you just having an orange tunic hanging around are low, and orange hasn't regularly been a fashionable colour for decades. I like to imagine a colour iceberg. At the top, easiest to find, is blue and black. This is closely followed by red and grey, then green, white and brown, then purple, then yellow and orange. I reserve the right to shuffle that iceberg as trends and seasons change, but we are not going to go from naught to charity shops suddenly being full of orange tunics and yellow dresses. Think about it before you colour code your factions. Is there any good reason they can't be blue, red and green? If you're going to specify the specific hue of a colour, pink rather than red, for example, or dark green, then you can usually move things at least one ranking more difficult to find. For that reason, my personal preference, if you are going to pick a colour scheme, which you don't have to, is to give options. Maybe it's the blue and orange, red and white and black and yellow factions instead. So you could only find a yellow scarf and the rest of your outfit is black. Still counts. Or maybe it's dark shades of any colour with black and dark grey accents. You've got an overall vibe going, but you aren't being excessively restrictive about the specifics. Colour is an amazing way to create unified group identities or an overall palette. Just don't shoot a third of your players in the foot by accident. Part 7, be specific, not prescriptive. There are few things I hate more than a costume brief that just gives you a picture and goes, wear something like this. How am I supposed to know what that kind of hat is called? How am I supposed to know what the layers going on are? Can I swap the trousers for a skirt? Which bits of this are important and which ones can I change? I did a whole video sharing good search terms for fantasy costume pieces, so please use it. Give people names and search terms for hunting down their costume. Tell them what the different pieces are and what the alternatives are. People do not know the names of different kinds of clothes, especially obscure clothes, and you need to know what something is called to search for it on the internet. So don't tell anyone to wear a hobbit outfit. You can wear a blouse or a shirt or a loose tunic. Here's a bunch of search terms like pirate and peasant. You can wear that with a full gathered skirt or trousers. Linen or velvet or corduroy would be great, but any fabric can work. Go for a rustic or old-fashioned feel. Even better is if you can add a waistcoat or bodice or stays over the top. An apron or a neckerchief made from from a handkerchief or square scarf would be amazing to finish the look off. If you're really stuck, just describe the pictures you've chosen to illustrate your brief with. If you've used pictures of players, ask them to describe their own costumes and the decisions they'd made, and what they think you could change. Any actual words you can give people go a long way to help them actually find something. Part 8, hair and makeup. So far we've talked a lot about clothes and a little bit about jewellery, but we haven't really talked about what's going on up here. This is a tough category. It can be nice to give some hints or direction in this regard, but it's really easy for those directions to create undue expectations that aren't realistic. Not everyone can wear makeup. No, not even light makeup. No, not even just on a specific part of their face. No, not even just face paint. No, not even that super nice, quite expensive hypoallergenic stuff you found. Some people cannot wear anything at all. No makeup needs to always be an acceptable option, and any brief guidance needs to be very clear that it's optional. I also think it's unreasonable to expect, precise details. Some people can draw symbols on their own face, a lot of people can't. Straight lines aren't a given. Keep your expectations low. It's fine to have suggestions of how people can go over the top, just make it very clear that they're suggestions, not expectations. Finally, before you request any specific colours, remember that people have a wide variety of skin tones, and those colours are going to look very different on different people. Your players will also have wildly varied hair lengths, hair textures, and hair colours, so recommending hairstyles, while a cool idea, is rarely going to work all that well in practice. Not everyone can or wants to wear wigs. Not everyone is comfortable wearing their hair in any specific way. Again, I think it's not a terrible idea to give some suggestions or options, but it would be nice to try and show some variety of hair types and lengths. Personally, nobody ever gives options for short hair. The suggestions are usually for people with long straight hair who want to braid it or do an updo. If you can't think of any suggestions for short hair and you're only actually giving guidance for a small subset of your players, why does this need to be in the costume brief? Not a costume brief point, by the way. Please wear sunscreen, even if you're also wearing makeup, and remember that PAX is not technically considered skin safe. I know you all wear it anyway, and many of you are fine. I'm not your real dad. You can make your own risk assessments. I just see a lot of people acting like it's a very safe option. It's designed for painting prosthetics. It was never supposed to go on people's actual faces. Just be really, really careful with it, and maybe don't tell people specifically to use it on their skin in your costume brief. Maybe don't do that. Okay, safety announcements aside, painting your face can be really fun, but unfortunately, we do need to mention the people who ruin it for everyone else. Part 9, Orientalism, baby. Your costume brief should not be racist. I know that feels like a low bar, and yet. On the subject of makeup, never ask people to change their skin tone to a different, real human skin tone. Ideally, outright ban it from your LARP. I cannot believe in the year of our Lord 2025 we're still arguing about whether it's okay to do blackface. It isn't. It hasn't been for decades. What is wrong with you? I'm going to be a real dick and say that that includes white. Dead white or just super pale is the default for a lot of people's undead or ghost options. Have you considered how that interacts with a player who is black? Black vampires aren't going to magically become pasty white. Suddenly, you have different guidelines based on a player's out-of-character race. This is a silly thing to do if you think about it for more than 3 seconds. Choose something else. I'm actually not a fan of full face makeup in general. I think it's cool if people really want to do it in a colour like pink or purple or green, but I think the minimum requirement there should be obvious patches. I just don't think you should ever require full face, and you definitely should be very careful about what colours people are allowed to do. Not allowing full face makeup at all potentially avoids awkward situations where it definitely wasn't intended to look like brown face, but it does. If you're going to be very vague about hairstyles in general, which is good, I don't think you need to worry too much about hair, but I do think if you are going to do hairstyles, you should try and show examples of people who are not white. Putting your hair in a Viking braid is a very different proposition for a white person with a minimal curl pattern than it is for a black person with 4C hair. Also, I think we need to talk about how many white people use LARP as an excuse to wear dreadlocks. I'm not even going to get into whether white people can or should wear dreadlocks. There are people more qualified to talk talk about it than me. I am talking specifically about the fact that a surprisingly large number of white people choose to portray fantasy cultures that are primitive or wild or monstrous or historically enslaved by wearing dreadlocks. That's weird, you guys. That's super weird. What are you doing? Did you think about this at all for more than like 2.5 seconds? And then there's the kimono. So background, I'm a costumer, I'm a rusty Japanese speaker, and an extremely rusty anthropology student. I know that the world is full of beautiful, inspiring clothing from different cultures, some of which is a close practice and you shouldn't wear, but a lot of it isn't. Cultural appreciation is a real thing that should be celebrated. If you want to bring your own culture to a LARP you are playing, I think that's amazing and I love to see it, and I wish LARP writers would make more space for the fact that fantasy doesn't have to look strictly Western European at all times. But I'm just not convinced that wholesale using someone else's culture for your fantasy LARP society is always as appreciative as you think it is. I'm always a little bit cautious when a kit brief tells you specifically to wear the clothing of a different culture to portray this make-believe nation. It's a very case-by-case thing. There is no one good answer to whether that's okay or not. Although I have straight up disregarded a brief before because the culture referenced was a minority indigenous one I didn't know a lot about, except that they're oppressed by the majority white government. And the gut instinct, that didn't feel like a good thing to wear as a costume. A LARP costume is a costume. Regardless of how respectful and well-researched you are making that clothing a costume. I'm extra suspicious, however, when that make-believe nation has some really specific vibes that intersect with the cultural clothing you've chosen in a really odd way. The best example I can give of this, because I've seen it like 5 times by now here in the UK, is explicitly using East Asian or even specifically Japanese clothing only to represent non-humans. It doesn't matter if you give those aliens or fish people or robots or whatever lots of positive qualities, you're explicitly saying this is how people who aren't human dress. Dehumanization is a very explicit form of racism, and I'm sort of horrified by how quickly so many LARPs have jumped to, well, kimono are a sign that you're just not really human. Also, I need you to look up what a model minority is and why it's incredibly harmful and racist before you start describing your kimono-clad aliens as really good at maths and science, deeply honorable and bad at emotions. This isn't theoretical. Someone did that. Don't do this. Don't put this in your costume brief. Just join a Japanese cultural society if you want to wear a kimono that bad. Or take lessons. You can take kimono dressing lessons online in English. This is not ancient history. It's a living practice done by real living people. Real living people who you are insulting with your crappy costume brief. Part 9. Aspirational can sod right off. To be clear, I'm not being mean about any system specifically here. It's just that one large system came up with a word to encapsulate everything I hate, and a bunch of smaller systems followed on with it because it seemed like a good idea. Aspirational is the nice way of saying your kit isn't good enough yet. It might be. One day, if you keep working on it and spending money on it, you got this thing, okay, well, that's good, but that thing would be better. You made this from scratch. Well, that was a year ago. Your skills have probably improved. It would be better if you made something new. It would be better if you added more stuff. It would be better if you paid more money. It would be better if you invested more time. It's not good enough yet. It could be better. Just let people be done. Let people do the bare minimum. People who really enjoy working on costume will keep working on their costume. You don't have to bully them into it. People who don't enjoy costume want something that is good enough and then to finish. The idea that kit is aspirational creates this idea that there is a standard, usually a standard achieved by professionals working on Hollywood movies, that you're not at but you should be working towards. Otherwise, you're not doing it right. A standard that is never going to be accessible to the majority of people because of skill level, or cash flow, or time. A standard that most people don't even want to achieve. It's a LARP. The point is not the costume. The point is the roleplay. I also don't like some of the attitudes that breeds amongst player bases where always be improving is the standard. If everyone is trying to improve all the time, that must mean they want your advice, right? That must mean they want you to tell them what they can improve on, which bits are wrong, what else needs doing, what more needs doing. You're not leaving it like that, are you? I wouldn't leave it like that. There's a pressure to share your kit so people can give you critique or tell you what you could add or improve on, and I just don't believe you're ever obligated to do that. Even benign comments like, oh, so what bit of your kit are you working on for next event, are unnecessary pressure. You don't need any of this. It doesn't do any good. Just leave people alone. Higher kit standards don't come from telling people they should be trying harder. I love designing and making kit, and if you tell me I have to make something for your game, and it has to be good, or at least better than last time, I am immediately going to refuse to do anything on principle. Higher kit standards come from people pushing themselves because they want to. Because they're inspired by your game, inspired by the people around them, and passionate about the world you're creating together. If your game is good enough, you don't need to tell people you have aspirational kit standards. The people who love making kit will push the envelope for you. Aspirational kit standards are just a stick to beat the people who don't love or enjoy making kit, and they should get to LARP too, because the point is the roleplay. Part 10, Death to Pinterest. It's time we dissected the dead horse I keep beating. Why shouldn't you use a Pinterest board as a costume brief? If you have a specific vibe in mind, it's not hard to go look at a picture and go, yeah, that's close enough. This makes creating a Pinterest board much easier than actually writing a costume brief. But only for you, the creator. For everyone else, instead of getting rules and guidelines, we get given a whole host of pictures and somehow have to generalize across all these inspiration images what exactly it is you were going for. That's not an easy or universal skill. I mean, you've literally just demonstrated, oh, game runner, that you don't have it or you can't be bothered to exercise it. It's really easy to create a Pinterest board with a specific aesthetic in mind. It's much harder to look at that Pinterest board and work backwards to figure out what aesthetic they were going for or how to implement that at your skill level. I can't easily look at 12 photos and translate that into an action plan for what I'm personally going to do, and I'm good at this. It's also not a very creative process at that point. 4 out of the 12 pictures have bell sleeves and the rest are all over the place, so I guess bell sleeves? I don't feel good about this decision. Then there's the skill level problem. You're not getting many pictures of normal LARP costumes on Pinterest. You're getting fantasy art, film stills, award-winning cosplayers at professional photo shoots, product photos for luxury goods. The popular images you're able to easily find are of an incredibly high standard, if they even really exist at all. I'm not even talking about AI, although that is now also rampant. I mean art and movie magic. Your average LARP player is not at the costume standard of a Hollywood production or a competition cosplayer, and there's no reason why they should be. So why set the bar that high, unless all you want is to make people feel bad? And finally, what's the point? Where's the meaning? Where's the strong visual identity that we talked about earlier in this video? It's the difference between, in this culture, men wear animals and women wear birds, sometimes as motifs, sometimes as jewelry, and sometimes just as oblique references, and which bird or beast you choose is an expression of your character. And I guess there's a lot of nature motifs in these pictures. A Pinterest board isn't even a good look and feel brief, at least not on its own. You want to make it clear what it is from these images that you're picking out, and you still want to be clear that your expectations are not film studio perfect. Do the work of writing the brief so that every single one of your players doesn't have to independently do all the work of figuring out what the hell you even meant. Part 11, I cannot keep having this conversation about gender. If your costume brief distinguishes between what men and women wear, your setting is not gender blind. I'm going to level with you. 99% of you are not prepared to write a gender blind costume brief. A truly gender blind costume brief is not just scrolling references to man and woman. You also have to strip out masculine and feminine, or any reference to the body type or shape the player might have or want to emulate. It's extra difficult if you want to use historical fashion as an influence, because for most cultures, for most of history, up to and including the present day, clothing is extremely gendered. You can say that dresses are a gender-neutral option until you're blue in the face, and some people will still involuntarily interpret them as feminine. Or you explicitly end up in a space where the choice is between practical and functional clothing you can fight in, i.e. men's clothing, and frivolous and impractical clothing for doing romance and talking in, i.e. women's clothing. That's a dick move, and also pretty sexist. There's a reason nobody can come up with better options for looking non-binary than playfully mismatching different gendered clothing, which doesn't work, incidentally. Even if you put all of your players into undifferentiated monochromatic sacks, people will gender each other based on their inherent physical characteristics, which is absolutely something you want to avoid at a LARP game. Basically, Suddenly, gender, or its absence, is a really important and present thing in our lives and our society, and throwing it out of the window for one weekend for a varied group of people who don't share the same values and background is just not something that's easy to achieve. There's a much bigger societal change afoot, but we are not there yet. But also, do you even want that? When I drill down to the core of it, most people don't actually care about their game being truly gender blind. They just want gender parity, trans inclusion, and an absence of sexism. I'm really sorry, you have to do actual meaningful work to have that in your game. You can't just scrub the words man and woman out of your briefs and tell everyone it's gender blind and have at it. Also, not to be like super trans about it, but gender and gendered clothing and gendered expectations are a super rich and interesting thing to play with in LARP. Build a whole abstract set of gender roles and markers, or steal them from history, and then watch people strive to uphold them or fight to subvert them. Gender is a wonderful playground, and everyone, yes, including cis people, especially cis people, can enjoy and benefit from being able to access that at a level they personally want to and feel comfortable with. If you take a strictly real-world attitude to it, however, playing as a gender other than the one you were assigned at birth can be really challenging and involve a lot of effort and often money. It doesn't have to, it's make-believe. Your options aren't just gender blind or gender is the main point of the game, and your costume brief can do a lot of heavy lifting here. Game-specific gender indicators can help stop gendering based on physical characteristics, and open up space for people to play with gender if they want. Remember that ignoring gender conventions is, in and of itself, a form of gender play. Coming up with 2 or more game-specific gender markers instead of 2 almost separate briefs of whole gendered outfits is relatively easy to do, makes gender play very easy, and doesn't have an outsized impact on the game as a whole. Also, imagine if you decide that green is a very feminine colour. Being able to look down a battle line and see all these people wearing green, and knowing you're inhabiting a world where you can be incredibly feminine and also bludgeon goblins to death with a sword. Fighting in a long dress is fighting on hard mode, but wearing green is easy. Conclusion. Nobody said writing a costume brief was easy. If it was easy, there wouldn't be so many bad ones. But also, costume is not as important as some of you think it is. We're all here for the roleplay. As long as you remember that your costume is supposed to enable the roleplay, not buy you access to being able to do it, you'll probably be alright. Nobody should be dropping out of your game because they feel like their kit isn't up to standard. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Your costume brief should inspire, suggest, an open space for people to play. It shouldn't be a rigid set of rules or a stick for the crew to beat players, or players to beat each other, or even players to beat themselves with. This is supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to be a role-playing event, not a dress-up game. There are much less physically demanding hobbies for people who just want to make top-tier costumes. We're here because we want to role-play. So let the costume brief support and inform that as an integral part of your rules set, not a bolt-on. And I'm extremely serious about those armor rules. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to keep the YouTube gods happy. Follow me on other platforms, and down in the description box you'll find a link to my Ko-fi page, or you can become a channel member, which gets you early access to all of my videos plus some fun extras. However you choose to support the channel, I couldn't do what I do without your help. Dream big, and I'll see you next time.